for that nice and brief introduction, because time is tight and I don't want to have my time taken up by where I went to high school or all of that kind of stuff. I want to thank you, Larry, for inviting me to come back. I guess it was, I don't know what, 11 or 12 years ago that I last spoke to this club about, funnily enough, a book on a previous Conservative Premier of Ontario, in that case, John Robarts. So happy to be back talking about the fellow I'm going to talk about today. I do want to just say a couple of hellos in the room if I can. Lillian, where are you? There you are. Lillian Weiss, who is, well, she says she's my biggest fan, and I'm sorry, like I think probably my mom is. So you might have to take second place to her. But Lillian, am I allowed to say how old you are, Lillian?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to anyway. Lillian is 97 and still showing up at this stuff. Fantastic. And I'm so pleased to see you again, and you're looking fantastic. Just keep going. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. That's great. And may I pay my respects to those who are in public service in the room. I think it's great that so many have come out today, including Michael Harris, whom I know well from his time at Queen's Park. I should also say, I've never used an iPhone in my life. I just haven't. I'm still a BlackBerry guy, old-fashioned. One guy clapping, that's the problem. But whenever I think I need a new BlackBerry, I go talk to Michael Harris and he tells me what to get, so that's why I still have my BlackBerry. And you know, it's a very strange coincidence. You are, of course, not the only Michael Harris to have been an MPP at Queen's Park. You may have heard of another one. And the guy I'm going to talk about today is actually not the only Bill Davis who was an MPP at Queen's Park. There was another MPP named Bill Davis from Scarborough as well. You guys should start a club of something, of whatever, the others. Students, congratulations to all of you. None of you was alive when the guy I'm talking about today was in politics. But I can tell you that he started out the same way that all of you did. And he only went on to become the second longest serving Premier of Ontario of all time. So, you never know. Even though you weren't alive for all of this, listen up. This may be your path. Who knows? I do want to, I guess, start by saying how unusual it is that Bill Davis did go on to become the second longest serving Premier of all time, because his career really did not start out well. And there were a few things that happened early on that, that almost derailed that political career that he seemed destined to have. The first thing that happened, first of all, I guess I should ask, he was Premier from 1971 to 1985. Who in this room was living in the province of Ontario at that time? 71 to, right. You're my kind of people. All right, so you know, you've got first-hand knowledge and first-hand memories of this guy then. But his first election was way back in 1959. He ran as in hopes of becoming a backbencher for Leslie Frost, who was the Premier of the day. And in a riding where the Conservatives were accustomed to winning by 10 and 15,000 votes because it was such a safe Tory seat, that being the riding of Peel, he barely squeaked in by 1,200 votes. And the reason is, the Prime Minister of the day, John Diefenbaker, did something just a few months before Election Day that really upset Bill Davis's plans. Anybody remember? Avro Arrow. You got it, Larry. He canceled the Avro Arrow, and there were only about 10,000 people in the riding of Peel who depended on the Arrow for their livelihood. So when Dief canceled the Arrow, being a Conservative was a bit of a tough sell at that time. And yet Davis managed to barely eke through a victory, won by about 3 or 4 votes per poll in that 1959 election. After Mr. Frost stepped down, John Robarts became Premier of Ontario, and Robarts kind of had his eye on Davis. He saw him as a rising star, and he wanted to put him in his cabinet, but he didn't at first. And one of the reasons he didn't was because a tragedy befell Mr. Davis in his private life, and Mr. Davis came real close to quitting politics at the time. He married his University of Toronto sweetheart, a woman named Helen McPhee, who was from Windsor, Ontario, and they got married. They had 4 kids very quickly, and then she got sick and died at the age of 31. I think very few people remember this, but 31 years old, she passed away, and there he was at the age of 33 with 4 kids under the age of 7, I think, and literally did not know what to do with himself. And he went to John Robarts, the Premier of the day, and he said, I'm sorry, Premier, but I'm going to have to quit politics. I can't be the father I need to be. These kids need me, and I just can't do it. And Robarts, who's a very savvy guy, a very wise guy, good judgment, said, hang on a sec, Billy, let's see if we can figure this out. Don't do anything rash yet. And of course, they did figure it out, and he did stay around. And within a couple of years, Bill Davis was appointed the Minister of Education, which back then was the biggest job in cabinet. Today it's the Minister of Health. The Minister of Health spends, 40 cents out of every dollar. Back then it was education. And Bill Davis ended up being the Minister of Education at an amazing time for the province of Ontario. We were building like crazy in the 60s. The money was just flying in. It was go, go, go. We got 5 new universities. We got the whole college system. Some of you may be going on to college. We got the whole college system back then. If you think about it, Centennial College, for example, started back then as this little place, 500 students in Scarborough. Anybody got a guess as to how many students there are at Centennial today? Take a guess. 500 back then. How many today? Mike Harris says 20,000. He's only off by a factor of 50%. Can you imagine? There's 40,000 students there today. And it's the same at Seneca, it's the same at Humber, it's the same at George Brown. This college system has been a phenomenal success for the province of Ontario. If you think about it, all you students back then, if you were graduating from grade 13 then, which we had, if you were graduating back then, you had very few choices. First of all, 40% of you didn't graduate. So 40% of you would have dropped out before high school was done. 10% of you would have gone on to university. I noticed as I was listening, I think probably all of you were going on to post-secondary. But back then, only 10% of you would have. A bunch of you would have got married and started having kids right away. There was no other alternative. Well, Bill Davis saw a gap. And he thought, we need a different alternative for some people. And what they did was they created the whole college system, 20 colleges, where people could go and learn different skills that weren't offered in the university sector. And it was a great success. It's 50 years old. The college system is 50 years old this year. They were building schools like crazy back then. He would travel all over Ontario and open as many as 3 schools a day back in the day. So it was a great time to be the Minister of Education. And when John Robarts' nearly 10 years as Premier were over and he decided to step down, Bill Davis decided to run to replace him and become the new leader of the Conservative Party. This would have been in 1971. And again, you want to talk about sort of near-miss experiences. 4 ballots, Maple Leaf Gardens, 2 o'clock in the morning, he wins by 44 votes. 44 votes. And I often think about how might history be different if 23 people at that convention had voted a different way. So, but they didn't. And he ends up winning and ends up having a very successful premiership. Although, I'm going to describe a first term, and I want you to tell me who I'm talking about. Okay, this premier that I'm going to describe won the leadership at Maple Leaf Gardens, took over from their predecessor, inherited a good situation, and increased the seat total. Almost got into trouble from the get-go. Scandals, allegations of mismanagement, police investigations, loss of a by-election held by the party for 30 years. Whose government am I describing?
Kathleen Wynne.
Michael Harris is right. I am describing Kathleen Wynne's government. I'm also describing Bill Davis's government. They have all those things in common and more. Both education ministers, both successful education ministers. And when, 4 years later, it came time for Bill Davis to seek a new mandate, I don't know what's going to happen next June, but I know that in 1975, when Bill Davis went back to the polls in hopes of continuing to be the government, he was 10 points down with a week to go, and he barely scraped it out of the fire. He won a minority government. Most of you won't remember what the big issue was in that election campaign, but just to show you that everything old is new again, can anybody take a guess at what that election, what issue did it hinge on?
Hydro.
It wasn't hydro, but you're close. What else is hot these days? Rent controls. Huge issue was rent controls. There were, 80 and 90-year-old widows being thrown out of their apartments in Toronto back then because they couldn't stand the double and triple-digit rent increases. And Bill Davis had to make a big decision in the days up to the 1975 election. He had to decide, do I want to stay true to my principles as a conservative and not bring in rent controls, Or do I want to save the silverware? And for him, it wasn't a tough choice. He made the pragmatic decision to bring in rent review, and the Tories managed to eke out a minority government, and they stayed in. Well, for the next 5 years, for the next 6 years, he sat atop a minority government at Queen's Park. And somehow, because he was not a hard-bitten, ideological, right-wing character, he was able to, on occasion, tack left to get the NDP support on some things, tack right to get the Liberal Party support on some things. It was a, even though it was a minority parliament, it was a genuinely more democratic institution back then. There was a lot of consultation among three parties. They solved problems together. I'm not saying there was no partisan politics, of course there were, but it was a different time. And there was a lot less politics of personal destruction. If any of you go into politics, that's mission one for you. Take some of the poison out of public life, okay? Too much poison in politics today. There wasn't as much back then. Not so much politics of personal destruction. And so, they managed, over the course of that 6 years, to have pretty collegial times. And Bill Davis got more and more successful. He had that near-miss experience in '75, and by the time in 1981 that he wanted to go back to the polls, he was so popular, he reclaimed his majority government. So, majority in '71, minority in '75, minority in '77, majority in '81. He got it back, which was very important to him. And if you're keeping score, that's 4 wins in a row. There's no premier since who's won 4 in a row. I'd be really impressed if anybody in this room knew who the last guy before Davis was to win 4 in a row. Shout out a name if you know. Frost only won 3 in a row. Mowat is too far back. Hepburn didn't win 4 in a row. It's hard. It's World War I time. Whitney won 4 in a row. So you got to go back 100 years to find somebody who did it. So that's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment to win 4 in a row. Mr. Davis's last term was really noteworthy for a few things. First and foremost, for you younger people, when I say Prime Minister Trudeau, you think of Justin. You're the only people in the room who do. For the rest of us, there is a different Prime Minister Trudeau that we think of first and foremost, and that is his dad, Pierre, who was the Prime Minister when I was your age. And one of the things that Pierre Trudeau thought was really unacceptable was the fact that the Constitution of Canada at the time was a simple act of the British Parliament. If we as Canadians wanted to amend our Constitution, the BNA Act, we had to go back to Britain and ask them for permission to do so. Pierre Trudeau thought that was nuts. And so he had a plan. He wanted to put together a kind of a consensus whereby he and the First Ministers would repatriate our Constitution, bring it home, in other words, so that we could amend it ourselves. Kind of like finally growing up as a country. And he wanted to attach to that Constitution a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we also did not have yet at that point. We had a Bill of Rights, but that was just an act of Parliament. It could be changed willy-nilly by Parliament if they wanted. Pierre Trudeau wanted something more entrenched. Rights that you would have that no Parliament could simply with a stroke of a pen override. So that was his mission. As he crossed the country to try to get support for that mission, only 2 guys signed on. Bill Davis was one of them, and Richard Hatfield from New Brunswick was the other. So Pierre Trudeau and 2 premiers wanting to do what I just described, and on the other hand, this so-called Gang of 8, 8 other premiers who were against, because they didn't want to give up the power that Parliament had to an unelected Supreme Court. They wanted to maintain that power. Okay, so what happens? Negotiations, lots of talks. They're getting nowhere. Finally, at the 11th hour, when it looks like nothing is going to happen and the talks break down, Bill Davis makes a very important late-night phone call to Pierre Trudeau. And in that phone call, he says, no, I think you're going to have to get the book to find that one out. Sorry. It's a never-before-told story, so I'm not going to give it up for nothing here. But I did. Mr. Davis has not talked about that phone call for the 35 years since we got a repatriated Constitution with a charter. But he told me what was in that phone call. And that story's in the book. Suffice to say, he made, he wouldn't want me to describe it as an ultimatum, but he basically said to Pierre Trudeau, you're going to have to put some water in your wine or I can't be with you anymore. And Pierre Trudeau thought about the notion of going to Great Britain to repatriate the Constitution with only New Brunswick on side and 9 other provinces against. Well, let's face it, he couldn't do it. It wasn't on. It just would be too illegitimate an exercise. So he put the water in his wine. They found the sweet spot, the great compromise. It wouldn't have happened without Bill Davis. For 35 years, in my view, he has not got the credit for that role that he played to make it all happen, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book and tell that story. Okay, that's big achievement number 1 during his last term. 1983. Was anybody at the 1980, is it 82 or 83? I can't remember now. 82 or 83 Grey Cup game at CNE Stadium in Toronto in the pouring rain. Anybody at that game? A few people. Okay, was it 82 or 83? 83? It was pouring rain. And Bill Davis and the then Metropolitan Toronto chairman, Paul Godfrey, were sitting outdoors, getting drenched in that rain. And what were people chanting? We want a dome. We want a dome. Okay, that's when the seeds were planted for what is now called the Rogers Centre, which back in my day was called the Sky Dome. They made the decision as they were sitting there in the rain getting poured on that Toronto needed a covered stadium. And even better, one with a retractable roof, the one and only in North America at the time. And Bill Davis, again, made that happen. He made the decision to make it happen and made the decision to put it at the foot of John Street in downtown Toronto, which has kick-started so much great development around there. If you remember this, I mean, the stadium opened in '89. This was a time when the downtowns of big American cities, they were folding up the sidewalks every night at 5 o'clock. I mean, you guys may, on those times when you go downtown Toronto, you want to go see a play, you want to go see a ball game, you want to go to a hockey game, you want to go to a great restaurant, you want to go to Ripley's, you want to go to the aquarium, you want to go to CN Tower. There's so many neat things to do down there right now. Not quite Queen's Park. Back then, there just wasn't that much. And the decision to put the dome downtown instead of out in the suburbs, like all American cities were doing, and having all of that activity move to the suburbs, was a great decision. It kept downtown Toronto vibrant. We have right now probably the best, I mean, Toronto or New York for the best downtown, anywhere in North America. Okay, so that was another big decision. The third big decision he made in that last term, I think, to this day, 33 years later, might be the most controversial decision he ever made. How many of you go to Catholic school here? Hands up. 1. Okay. You haven't paid tuition to go to Catholic school, have you? You don't even know what I'm talking about, because only for the last 33 years, no one's paid tuition to go to Catholic high school. Back then, you did. Back then, taxpayers funded, separate school system up to the end of grade 10. If you wanted to go to grade 11 or 12 or 13, in the Catholic school in which you had been in that system that you'd been going to for your whole life, you had to pay tuition out of your pocket. As a result, a lot of medium and lower income Catholic families couldn't afford it, and they didn't. And those Catholic families had to take their kids out of that school system where they had gone for 10 years and move them over to the public system. And I know the public school kids in grade 11, one of whom I talked to, whose name is Kathleen Wynn, remembers being back in grade 11, living in Richmond Hill, and seeing all these new Catholic kids coming into the public school system in grade 11 because they couldn't afford the tuition to go to school. Bill Davis won the 1971 election very much, if I can put it this way, by sticking it to the Catholics. A few days before Election Day, he said, "I've thought long and hard about this. I know the Catholic community would like me to extend full funding to the end of high school, but I think it would be too divisive. I think it would fragment our school system. I think it would cause sectarian strife, and so I'm not going to do it." And Ontario in 1971, which was not the Ontario of 2017, thought, this is great. Because Ontario in 1971 was a very much more waspy place, with a lot of people with a last name like Harris. And not too many with a last name like Pick any one of these kids around this table. What's your last name?
Kolojek.
Kolojek. There weren't too many of those kinds of people. And as a result, the Tory core of Ontario kind of thought it was a great idea for the Conservative government of the day to deny Catholics what they had been seeking since Confederation, namely a fully funded parallel school system, which was the deal that this province and this country made at that time to the Catholic community. Fast forward 13 years, 12th of June, 1984, Bill Davis gets up in the legislature that day, and imagine this, without telling his Minister of Education. And I talked to Betty Stevenson for the book. She's 92 years old, she still hasn't forgiven him. He got up in the legislature and basically said, I've thought about this some more, and the time has come. And he made the announcement to extend full public funding to the end of what was then grade 13, now grade 12 of course, to the separate school system. And now in Ontario we have our choice of a fully funded public school system, if you're Catholic, a fully funded separate school system, and a fully funded French school system as well. I've often heard politicians say, if we had to create it from scratch today, this is not what we would come up with. But given the compromises over the years, this is what we have. It was a hugely controversial decision at the time. The teacher unions, the Anglican Church, all came out opposed to this policy. It was extremely controversial. I think it still probably is, 33 years later. There's a lot of people I know who have still not come to terms with or agreed with this decision. But he made it, and then having made it, 3 months later he retired. He'd been in public life for 25 years. He gathered his family at the cottage at Georgian Bay, and he basically said, I've been in public life for a quarter of a century. I'm in my mid-50s. It's time to do something else. Imagine this. He came back to Queen's Park the next day to tell his cabinet and caucus that he wanted to retire. There were tears all around the table. They begged him to stay. How often do you hear that in public life? We're begging you to stay. No, usually it's don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out. They begged him to stay because in spite of the separate school decision, which was unpopular in a lot of quarters, they knew, one, he'd be the only guy who could get it through without a great deal of turmoil. And number two, they needed him to win that next election, which would have been a year away. They begged him to stay. And they said, look, just stay another year. Lead us through what would have been a 5th election win. Lead us through another election win, and then 6 months, a year later, you can retire. And he wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it, again, imagine this. He wouldn't do it because he knew that the first question he'd be asked at the press conference when he called the election would be, Mr. Davis, do you intend to serve the whole term? And he couldn't look at the members of the media, and by extension, to the people of Ontario and say, yes, when he knew in his heart the answer was no. He couldn't lie. Somebody says that's not true today. Well, I'll give you a little example, like George Washington, right? I cannot tell a lie. Richard Nixon, I cannot tell the truth. Donald Trump, I cannot tell the difference. Anyway, no, I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, he stepped down. A guy named Frank Miller took over. A lot of what the Tory party feared didn't take place. Miller did not have the special sauce. He just didn't have that magic leadership that Bill Davis did. And he ended up losing the ensuing election. That was the end of a 42-year-long Tory dynasty in Ontario. That's a pretty good run. Michael Harris is looking forward to 1 year of Tory government, let alone 42. In any event, so that's the Bill Davis story. Now, let me take a couple of minutes here, a few minutes, and just tell you a little bit about this book and how it came. How am I doing here? Good. I'll be real quick, and then we'll take some questions. Ever since Bill Davis retired, and I covered his last government at Queen's Park, ever since Bill Davis retired, I started bugging him about doing his book, because he had a very consequential premiership, and I thought somebody ought to write a good book about it, and since I knew him a little bit, I thought, why not? He never said yes. He always put me off. He never said no, but he never said yes. And I would start to send him little emails over the years, like, I remember about 10 years ago, I said, send him an email. Mr. Davis, I just read a book about Leslie Frost. You actually got mentioned in the book, here, here, and here. Give you any ideas? And his secretary would, he doesn't email, but his secretary would send me an email back saying, Mr. Davis has asked me to tell you that if you ever do this book project together, his book will have to be longer than Leslie Frost's book because his premiership was longer than Leslie Frost. So very funny. My wife called him a few years ago. You know, I guess he's 84 years old at the time. Mr. Davis, my husband's not getting any younger. You might want to say yes to this at some point. I think finally what prevailed upon him was a couple of things. At one point, about 3 years ago, I stopped being Mr. Nice Guy, and I said, Premier, you have a duty to history to share what you know. You got elected in 1959. You know so much. You had a front row seat to so much. You can't take all of those stories and all that information to your grave. It would be a crime against history. And one more thing. There was a guy in the late 80s who wrote a book about him named Claire Hoy. That name may mean something to some of the people in this room. And it was a really vicious, nasty book. And I said to Mr. Davis, do you really want to give Claire Hoy the last word on your life? And that, kind of sticking a shiv in there when I said that. I got a call from his secretary the next day who said, please come up to the house next week. Mr. Davis would like to have a chat with you. Anyway, he finally said yes. And I'll leave you with this thought. It was probably about 10 years ago that I kind of had a vision of having him say yes, spending a lot of time with him. I was 10 when he became premier, 10 years old. So he was kind of a big deal in my life. And he stayed premier until I was 24. So getting a chance to spend a lot of time with him, getting to ask questions about stuff that he'd not talked about before, hearing stories that he'd never told other people, and then after it was all said and done, writing up a big book, which is longer than Leslie Frost's, I would point out, having a big party in downtown Toronto where all of his friends and family and former colleagues would show up, 300 people, me getting up there, introducing him getting up to the microphone, and just at the age of 87, which he now is, just killing it. Touching, funny, warm, hilarious, serious. He just was, in my vision of how this would roll out, that's what would happen. And the amazing thing is, all of that happened exactly like that. We had it last October. Great party, and he was fantastic. And I'm just so glad he said yes. And with that, I thank you so much for your invitation, and I'm delighted to take whatever questions you might have.